Hey guys, it's Jakov, and I'm here today to follow up my video breaking down the update changes of Total War Rise of Mordor version 0.6.0 by going into an in-depth breakdown of the Easterling faction overhaul. If you're new to this channel, Total War Rise of Mordor is a mod for the game Total War Attila, revamping it into the world of Lord of the Rings instead of the fall of the Roman Empire, the mod being linked in the description, as will be my update video on the mod itself. Because the Easterling roster received a significant amount of changes, I decided that taken together, they were deserving of their own video, which is ironic given in the previous update, I made a video due to them also receiving an extensive overhaul, so you can consider this video a revamp of the Easterlings. Because this will be the third video I've made on the Easterlings, including that update video, and the unit breakdown of the faction as a whole, those two videos also being linked in the description, I'm not going to go over the Easterling history and universe, except to say that they're a collection of clans in Eastern Middle-earth who generally tend to be under the sway of the Dark Lord Sauron and are enemies of the Free Peoples of Middle-earth, although not every Easterling serves under the banner of Mordor. With that out of the way, let's look at the changes the faction has seen as of the update, beginning with the smallest change, the transfer of the Runic Warriors from the melee infantry line into the axe infantry line. While this may not seem like much of a change, given that units are sometimes switched around in updates between different unit categories, taken together with the addition of several new units to the faction, it means that the Eastlings no longer have any melee infantry units at all, and now have a robust axe infantry lineup which until the update was a category of unit the faction lacked entirely. Overall, not a massive change, but one that now means that my previous ranking of the unit compared to other melee infantry is suspect, and that future ranking videos will now have to change to accommodate this new information. Moving on from the Locae Rim Macemen and their category status, we come to the first of the new units added to the mod, the Runic Savages, a welcome addition to the faction's shock infantry lineup. A very visually striking unit, the Runic Axes have a unique look that separates them from practically every other unit, even if their outfit isn't exactly practical, something we're going to get into. For head protection, these warriors wear a variety of horned and crest helmets. The helmets, particularly the horned ones, somewhat resembling the stereotypical horned Viking helmet of pop culture, which didn't exist, as well as the horned helmets of the sea people of the Bronze Age, which very much existed if period imagery is anything to go by. Taking a closer look at the helmets, some appear to have a large raised ridge in their centre which acts as both a stiffening support for the helmet, but also as a nasal guard, while others have cheek guards and multiple raised crests, looking similar to some of the helmets used by the orcs of Dol Guldur and the helmets of the elves. Finally, all the helmets have a raised spike upon which a horsehair crest can be attached, really solidifying the Bronze Age look of these troops, as do their magnificent beards. For body armour, these troops only have segmented spoulders on their left arms, which resemble the armour pieces worn by some Japanese troops such as samurai, while their waist is protected by a band of folds, their forearms also having braces. That, however, is the extent of their armour, only wearing leather boots and fabric pants and robes, the most glaring issue being of course that their upper torso is completely unprotected, not even having a shirt, which, while showing off their great tattoos, leaves them extremely vulnerable, especially given they don't have any shields to provide even a modicum of defence. Going into battle shirtless was no doubt something that often occurred in history, more so with primitive cultures that tended to lack armour-making processes. However, the survival and victory rate for unarmoured warriors who engaged in battle against armoured foes speaks for itself. For weapons, these troops use two-handed axes that have a metal spike at the top of their shafts, making them slightly more useful, given that the spike isn't long enough to make them comparable to multi-purpose weapons like halberds. The axes overall resemble more ancient world axes, such as those utilised by ancient Egyptian troops as well as Persians, rather than medieval axes. Looking at the unit officer, he's a typical Locae Rim officer, wearing red robes over which he wears an assortment of bronze armour. His helmet resembles a mix between a Phrygian helmet with extensive cheek pieces and a small Ashigaru helmet, being tipped with a crest that acts as a nasal guard and another ornate metal crest that serves as an indicator of the officer's rank, similar to the crest utilised by Roman officers in real life and Uruk-hai officers in the mod. Attached to his helmet, the officer has a fabric aventail, while his torso is protected by a combination of segmented folds for his waist and a square plate with a raised dome for his upper chest, that plate resembling the pieces of armour that were used early on by the warring Italian tribes and city-states, including the Roman Kingdom and early to mid-Roman Republic, a metal codpiece being attached to the folds to protect his groin. His arms are protected by segmented van braces and spoulders, the spoulders being particularly spiky, while his lower legs have leather greaves. For his shield he uses what I can only say resembles an upside-down kite shield of sorts, or an odd-shaped Pavis shield, being quite large and having both a bronze boss for strengthening as well as a bronze rim, metal rims and bosses seeing used on kite shields for sure. The spiky tip of the shield potentially being useful as a weapon, or for flipping upside down and planting so as to make a mobile fortification. For a weapon, the officer uses a single-handed sword with a meaty blade that most resembles the Migration-era swords of the early Middle Ages, which eventually evolved into the arming swords of the High and Late Middle Ages, although this one does look longer. As a unit, these guys are the earliest tier shock infantry you can gain access to, and as such are quite useful from the early game to the mid game, giving you a force of heavy hitters, although they do have extensive weaknesses. For starters, the unit is extremely vulnerable to shock cavalry, like all shock infantry, but archers and other ranged units take it to a different level, being capable of destroying this unit with a few volleys due to how unarmoured they are. When deploying this unit, I recommend having ranged troops provide them support, especially against enemy ranged units, with the Savages losing their advantage when pressed into service as a defensive unit, as the faction does have better options when going on the defensive. Overall, a useful unit that helps enrich the Easterling experience. Moving on from the Runic Savages, we come to the first new addition to the faction's axe line, the Clan Axemen. These are among the lightest melee infantry that the faction can field, and their equipment reflects that. To their credit, despite being levies, every warrior in the unit wears a helmet, some having a basic raised skull cap shape with ridges for extra strengthening and attached points for horsehair crests, something utilised by historical warriors. In addition to these helmets, some in the unit wear helmets that resemble the standard high-tier Easterling helmets, but with their faceplates removed, only having the upper portion of the helmet which resembles a cross between a shrunk-down Ashigaru helmet and a kettle helmet, with a raised frontal ridge, many of their helmets having leather pieces attached to the side to provide extra protection, something seen historically by troops in place of mail coifs or aventails, others instead just having veils and hoods for defence. One thing to note is that a lot of these helmets look to be rusting, suggesting that these are older pieces of military equipment being put into service by soldiers who lack any other alternative. Moving on from their helmets, the Clan Axemen completely lack armour, which makes the decision to prioritise on helmets highly historically accurate, as if there was any bit of armour a soldier would want in history, it'd be a helmet due to just how important the head is for survival. Instead of armour, these men wear their regular clothing, being a mix of shirts and tunics, although if any of them are quilted, they might provide some modicum of protection. Mongol troops, for example, going into battle practically as lightly armoured, although in their case they weren't serving as infantry but instead light cavalry, where a lack of armour was a positive rather than a negative. Moving to their equipment, these axemen wield fair-sized round shields that have leather rims and coverings over their wooden surfaces, having a raised metal boss for added protection, such shields seeing widespread use in Europe in the early Middle Ages. For weapons, the unit wields a couple of javelins for skirmishing, such weapons most likely being converted to hunting implements, the javelins having barbs to prevent the shaft from penetrating the target too deeply. In addition to these javelins, they wield one-handed axes which have very thin blades, resembling the ones used in Persia and India during the 16th and 17th centuries, some of the axes being double-sided, something that wasn't really done historically, while others have spikes on the back to make them effective piercing weapons, where the shaft of the axe is sharpened to allow it to stab enemies, though to my knowledge such axes were used more on horseback rather than by infantry. The unit officer is almost identical to the previous officer, except that his helmet is crested with a moon and that his weapon is a sword that very much resembles the ancient Egyptian khopesh, with its heavy cutting blade, while his shield is made of wood covered by a layer of bronze, similar to the hoplons used in ancient Greece, though this shield is rectangular rather than round, resembling a Roman scutum with a raised boss in the centre of the shield. Turning to the unit role, on the battlefield these will be an early building block of armies, their skirmisher abilities giving them some flexibility compared to other early game infantry that they're likely to face. That combined with their status as an axe unit means that in melee, they're more effective on the offensive than the sword infantry they'll generally face, making for a unit that suits the Easterling's aggressive playstyle, being a good fodder unit to bleed enemies of strength, although they are easily overpowered by enemy units, meaning that using them in the late game is a losing strategy generally. Luckily for prospective Easterling generals, the faction does have a better option in the form of Runic Warriors. Equipment-wise, these troops are more uniform, wearing red robes over which each wears an assortment of bronze armour, somewhat resembling the Hastati infantry of the Roman Empire in some respects. These warriors wear the same helmets as the Clan Axemen, although their helmets are shiny and polished, reflecting their professional status. For body armour, each man has at the very least ornately decorated bronze vambraces, while some have bronze belts and cod pieces, others having overlaid pieces to protect their gut, while others have small square plates protecting their upper torso, reminiscent of those used by the Easterling officers, but also the gorgets seen in service for centuries by cavalrymen and officers into the 20th century, others having overlaid scales protecting their chest, these men overall having significantly more armour than the previous unit. For shields, they use the same bronze-covered shield as the previous unit officer, greatly improving their combat survivability, while for weapons they use the same variety of axes as the Clan Huntsman. The unit officer was identical to the Runic Savages officer, so we'll skip him and move on to the unit role. In battle, these guys will serve as the bulk of your infantry, being a clear step up from the Clan Axemen, being capable of fighting most tier 2 units. Their axe abilities also making them more formidable on the offensive, although somewhat unfortunately they lose the javelins that their predecessors had, becoming less like Roman infantry funnily enough. Recruiting these guys is something I very much recommend, as while the top tier units do crush them, they serve well as second tier units in a support role, even in late tier armies where their numbers may prove useful if deployed in an opportune time, even then serving as semi-shock infantry. Overall a very useful unit that makes the Easterlings that much more versatile, which is something you like to see in any faction. Moving on to the spear infantry of the Easterlings, we have a new addition to that unit line, the Clan Spearmen, who are the spear equivalent of the Clan Axemen. Equipment-wise, these warriors are mostly identical to the Axemen, even down to the rusty helmets, only really being differentiated by their weapons and shields, having shields that look almost identical to the rectangular form of the Roman scutum. The main difference between this shield and the historical one being that this one is made of wicker covered with leather, whereas the real ones were made of hard wood rimmed with bronze or iron, being far hardier than the Easterling version. For weapons, these troops have a dagger at their side but use barbed spears as their primary implement of war. The spears looking to be inspired by the weapons utilised by tribal warriors around the world such as African tribesmen and indigenous Australians, as well as the many Polynesian warriors of the Pacific Ocean. Such weapons are more useful for hunting than warfare, which makes sense given these are hunting tools that have been pressed into service as weapons to kill enemies. Skipping the officer who's identical to the Clan Axeman officer, we'll move on to the unit role. These troops are the early core of your army, holding the line against enemy infantry and threatening marauding cavalry, being a fairly tough unit all things considered, being quite resilient to archers. That said, because they are a peasant levy, the unit is incapable of making spear war formations, making them that much less effective against all potential foes, meaning that when fighting cavalry they should be used as an offensive option, attacking stuck cavalry rather than the defensive, where the lack of formations leaves them vulnerable to enemy charges. Overall a useful unit, although the Clan Guard are an amazing improvement over them in every way. Moving on from the Clan Spearmen, we come to the first of the new archer units added to the faction, the Clan Huntsman. Equipped much the same as the other low tier clan units, these troops are differentiated by the leather braces that they wear on their arms, less as armour and more as protection against their bowstrings, where they have quivers on their back. For weapons, these troops have knives and kopeshes in case melee occurs, although their main weapon is of course the bow that they all wield. The bows seem to be a typical short bow, made more for hunting animals than killing in battle, not having the power or range of other types of bows such as long bows and recurve bows. Skipping their standard officer who wields a kopesh like his men, we'll move on to their usefulness as a unit. In battle, these guys provide much needed range power in the early game, though even then they are quite lackluster, being abysmal marksmen who are doomed if they were attacked by any infantry or cavalry. However, while the unit may not seem like much, it's perfect at killing opposing skirmishers, given that the unit does have the range advantage over such foes, improving its usefulness. As a last-ditch effort, this unit can be used to attack enemies in the rear in melee, though even then they're quite fragile and likely won't have that large of an impact. My recommendation is to use them due to the ranged abilities they give you, but to replace them with the next unit I'm about to cover as quickly as you can. Moving on to that next unit, we have the Runic Arches, who are the ranged equivalent of the Runic Warriors. Although the two units look almost identical, the Archers lack shields but also have helmets that have a male avantal attached to provide extra protection, a bit of equipment that the Warrior unit lacks, these helmets very much resembling those used in the Indian subcontinent during the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. For weapons, these troops use kopeshes, with their weapon of choice being metal-tipped recurve bows. Such a choice of weapon makes a lot of sense, given that they're a clear upgrade over the previous unit's weapons, and match the steppe aesthetic of the faction perfectly, given that these weapons were most notably used in the hands of steppe peoples such as the Mongols and the Cumans. The weapons are great not only because of their range and power, but also because of their compact size, meaning that they're far easier to carry on campaign and use than longbows. Skipping the unit officer, on the battlefield this unit will make up the majority of your range forces if an infantry-oriented army is your preferred playstyle for the mid-game. Being capable of being amassed in large numbers, this more than offsetting their general middle-of-the-road status for mid-tier units. Against lesser troops they're quite a threat, while facing off against equivalent units that at the very least a match for them, although more professional archers do outperform them as is to be expected, with the unit not being the best at absorbing enemy punishment. In melee, the unit is best kept in reserve and is useful for attacking enemies in the flank and rear, being somewhat capable of fending off rabble in a head-on fight. Generally a great unit that will be the heart of your ranged power for the mid-game until they're replaced by the professional low-K-rim archers and variag bowmen. Moving on from the archers, we come to the sole cavalry unit added to the Easterling roster in the update, the Clan Raiders. These warriors ride unarmoured horses, the riders themselves essentially being Clan Axemen but on horseback, using the same shields as that unit but wield two types of weapon, the first being backwards pointing barbed javelins for skirmishing, while their main weapons are kopeshes. Moving straight past their kopesh wielding officer, the Clan Raiders' role is quite simple, As of the current state of the mod, these are the only melee cavalry that the faction has access to, and as such will be the core of your cavalry forces unless small groups of elite shock cavalry or mounted archers are your strategy of choice. When selected, these guys give your army mounted skirmisher capabilities as well as speed and maneuverability, being great at cutting down light infantry and archers as well as being useful in early iterations of hammer and anvil cavalry charges. As these troops can be used all the way to the late game, they are a considerable threat against more elite cavalry units when used en masse, swarming shock cavalry and using their numbers to prevail. I consider this a great unit in the faction roster, as it currently stands, even if archers, spears and pikes can pose a significant threat to it. With the clan raiders covered, all the units added to the Easterling roster have been looked at, so let's go over how these changes as a whole impact the Easterlings. With all these new units, the Easterlings have gone from a faction that was comprised almost entirely of professional infantry and cavalry to a faction that now has options, its lower tiers now being far more fleshed out and allowing for far more variety when playing as them, making the faction closer to fully fledged factions such as Gondor rather than pretty empty factions. This update has very much been appreciated, and I hope the mod creators can follow it up with even more great content. If you've enjoyed this video, please let me know in the comments and like and subscribe if you want to see similar content. It might not seem like much, but for such a small channel, it's greatly appreciated. This is your host Jakov, signing off.